In 1590, an English governor returned to a colony he had left behind 3 years earlier. He expected hunger, he expected fear, he may even have expected graves. What he found instead was something worse. The settlement was empty. No bodies, no battle, no fire, no final message of panic. Only one carved word: Croatoan. An entire colony had vanished. And more than 4 centuries later, no one can say with certainty whether the colonists were absorbed, scattered, starved, killed, or simply erased by the kind of history that leaves behind almost no final scene at all. My name is Ilyas, and tonight we open another file from the Cold Case Atlas. Case number 005. Roanoke Island, North America, the Lost Colony of Roanoke. Pay close attention. Let's begin. To understand why Roanoke became one of the oldest mysteries in English colonial history, you first have to understand what this colony was meant to be. In 1587, Governor John White led 117 men, women, and children to the New World. Their intended destination was the Chesapeake Bay, where the English hoped to plant a more permanent settlement. But the expedition stopped at Roanoke Island, and that is where the settlers remained. On the 22nd of July 1587, they came ashore and began rebuilding the damaged remains of an earlier English outpost. From the very beginning, the colony was unstable. Relations with nearby Algonquian peoples were already fragile. Soon after the settlers arrived, an Englishman named George Howe was killed. In retaliation, White and his men attacked what they believed was a hostile Croatoan village, but it was actually a Croatoan settlement, damaging one of the few relationships that might have helped the colony survive. At the same time, food was uncertain, winter was approaching, and the settlement was still not where White had intended it to be. And yet, even in that uncertainty, there was one moment that later generations would remember almost like a symbol. On the 18th of August 1587, White's granddaughter, Virginia Dare, was born on Roanoke Island, the first child born to English parents in the New World. In later memory, that birth came to represent promise, the idea that England might truly take root in North America. But within days, the colony was already in trouble. According to the National Park Service, the threat of attack, failing supplies, and the approach of winter forced White to sail back to England for reinforcements and food. He left in late August, having been on Roanoke for little more than a month. Before he sailed, it was determined that the remaining colonists would not necessarily stay in one place. One group would remain on Roanoke Island, while another would head inland in search of a more permanent settlement and better access to supplies. That detail matters, because the mystery of Roanoke may never have been the disappearance of one compact village. It may have been the disappearance of a colony already beginning to divide, adapt, and move before history lost sight of it. White intended to return quickly. He did not. England's war with Spain and the chaos around the Armada years delayed him for roughly 3 years. By the time he finally reached Roanoke again in August 1590, the colony had already passed out of the historical record and into legend, and this is the image that made the story immortal. John White stepping back onto Roanoke Island on the 18th of August 1590, exactly 3 years after Virginia Dare's birth, and finding the settlement deserted, not smashed, not burned, not obviously overrun, just empty. Houses had been taken down rather than destroyed. The place had been reinforced with a stronger palisade, and at the entrance, carved clearly into wood, was the word Croatoan. Nearby, on a tree, the letters CRO had also been cut. That was the beginning of the mystery. Not because the colony vanished into thin air, but because it seemed to vanish deliberately. What makes that disappearance so powerful? Even now, is that it seems to violate the logic people expect from disaster. When a settlement collapses, we expect visible ruin. We expect fire, bodies, broken defenses, abandoned food, or at least some final sign that panic had reached the surface. Roanoke offers almost none of that in a clean form. Instead, it offers something much harder for the mind to process: absence with intention. The colonists did not seem to disappear in terror. They appeared to leave behind a message, preserve a level of order, and move on. And that changes the feeling of the story completely. Because now the mystery is no longer just what killed them. It becomes what happened after they made a decision that seemed, at least to them, survivable. That question is much more difficult, and it is one reason Roanoke still resists closure. The disappearance of Roanoke did not become famous simply because people were gone. It became famous because of what wasn't. When history gives us catastrophe, it usually gives us a shape: ruins, graves, burned walls, bones, a last stand, a massacre site, a disease pit. But Roanoke offered none of those in any clean form. When White came back, he did not report a destroyed colony, he reported a dismantled one. That distinction is one of the most important details in the whole story. The houses were taken down, not blown apart by panic. The fortifications were still there. There was no carved cross above the word Croatoan, even though White had instructed the colonists in 1587 that if they moved under distress, they should carve the destination and add a cross as a signal of danger. He found no such distress mark. So the first great emotional twist of Roanoke is this: at the exact moment the mystery should become darker, it almost becomes calmer. Because the scene White described does not look like sudden destruction. It looks like departure. And that is what makes the case so difficult. A violent ending is, in some ways, easier for history to explain. A battlefield can be excavated. A fire leaves patterns. Bodies can sometimes be counted. But a planned departure into a landscape of marshes, islands, forests, rival communities, shifting coastlines, and incomplete records is much harder to reconstruct. The people of Roanoke may not have vanished in one moment at all. They may have moved in stages. And once they moved, history's grip on them weakened almost immediately. There is also another reason this disappearance shocked contemporaries and still unsettles viewers today. Roanoke was not just a group of soldiers or explorers. It included families. It included women. It included children. It included White's own daughter and granddaughter. In other words, this was not a scouting party failing at the edge of empire. It was an attempt to plant ordinary life in an extraordinary place. And when ordinary life disappears, the emotional effect is stronger than when only armed men go missing. The mystery was intensified by what happened next. White did not follow the clue to its conclusion. He believed Croatoan pointed toward Croatoan Island, present-day Hatteras Island, home to a friendly native community and the place of origin of Manteo, one of the most important indigenous figures connected to the English colonies. White was encouraged by the message. According to his own account, he took it as a certain token that the colonists were still alive and had gone to a place associated with allies. But storms, damage to the ships, loss of anchors, rough seas, and dwindling supplies prevented a full search. The effort to sail to Croatoan failed, and that failure froze the mystery at its most tantalizing possible point. White had a clue, believed he understood it, and still could not reach the place it seemed to name. There is also something deeply tragic in White's position. Later generations often remember him as the man who came back and found nothing. But the emotional truth is harsher than that. He did not return to total emptiness. He returned to a sign that seemed to speak directly to him. A place name, a clue that appeared legible, a message that seemed to say, "We moved, and we wanted you to know where." And then weather, damage, timing, and fear kept him from following it. That means Roanoke is not only a mystery of disappearance, it is also a mystery of interruption, a case in which the answer may have been closer than history allows us to recover, and that, in some ways, is more painful than having no clue at all. Because the mind keeps returning to the same thought. If White had only reached Croatoan, would this story still be famous? Or would it have become just another hard colonial survival story, remembered by specialists and forgotten by everyone else? That is one of the reasons Roanoke became folklore. Because it was not merely unsolved. It was almost followed, almost explained, almost recovered, and then lost again. At this point, the mystery should have become simpler. Instead, it became more human. Because what John White found did not look like a massacre. It looked like a decision. If you strip away the ghosts, the pop mythology, and the dramatic simplifications, one explanation rises above the rest. The colonists moved. And the strongest version of that theory is not the Chesapeake Bay, and not instant death on the island. It is Croatoan. The reason this theory is so persuasive is that it is supported by the very clue the colonists appear to have left behind. White had specifically instructed his people that if they moved, they should carve the name of the place where they had gone. In 1590, he found Croatoan clearly carved without any sign of distress. The simplest reading is still the most powerful one. They were trying to tell him where they went. Croatoan was both a place and a people, and Manteo's community there had been among the English colonists' closest native allies. White himself believed this explanation made sense, and in practical terms, it makes sense too. If your settlement is under-provisioned, vulnerable, geographically exposed, and trapped between weak English logistics and unstable local relations, you do not stay still unless you have to. You move toward the people most likely to tolerate or help you. You move toward a coast and community, already known to at least some in your group. You move toward a place that can offer food, local knowledge, and the possibility of absorption rather than annihilation. That is exactly why the Croatoan theory continues to feel more convincing than the others. It is not just romantic, it is rational. And over time, archaeologists have recovered Elizabethan-era artifacts on Hatteras Island that keep the theory alive. The National Park Service notes that artifacts from the period have been found there, and for many people, those finds reinforce the idea that at least some of the colonists may have relocated southward. There is also a broader historical logic to this theory. Colonial survival in the 16th century often depended less on European self-sufficiency than on alliances, trade, adaptation, and, in some cases, assimilation into indigenous worlds. Roanoke was not a later imperial colony with deep resupply networks and military reinforcement. It was fragile from the start. In that context, joining or being absorbed into a native community is not a strange ending. It may be the most normal ending available. That, in fact, may be one of the reasons the story survives so well in English language culture. Because the most plausible answer is also one that older colonial memory often found difficult to accept in full, not a clean English disappearance, not a single burial ground, but a drifting away from English control and into a different social world. And this is where Roanoke becomes more than a mystery. It becomes a mirror. Because the version of the story people prefer often says as much about them as it does about the colony. A massacre is easier to imagine than assimilation. A dramatic extermination is easier to tell than a slow fading of English identity into another social world. A tragic end preserves the colony as purely English until the last moment, But survival through adaptation complicates that picture. It suggests that at least some colonists may have lived not by preserving the world they came from, but by entering one that English history later struggled to center. That possibility is not supernatural. It is historical. And perhaps that is exactly why it has always been harder for popular culture to embrace. Because it transforms Roanoke from a mystery of vanishing into a mystery of changing. And history is often far less comfortable with transformation than it is with disappearance. There is another strong element in favor of movement, rather than sudden destruction. The colony appears to have been in the process of reorganizing itself before White even left. The National Park Service notes that one group was expected to remain on Roanoke while another would head inland. This means that even before the final disappearance, the colony's future may have involved multiple destinations and multiple survival strategies. If that is true, then asking where did the colony go may already be the wrong question. It may not have gone to only one place. And that is why this act of the story is so powerful, because for the first time, the mystery begins to look solvable. Not supernatural, not impossible, just incomplete. For a moment, Roanoke stops being the vanished colony and becomes a desperate community trying to make one hard decision after another. But this is exactly where the story pushes back, because the Croatoan theory explains the clue. It does not fully explain the evidence. The National Park Service is careful about this. Yes, artifacts from the Wright period have been found on Hatteras Island, but they also note that no human remains, no confirmed graves, no definitively linked village site, and no settlement remains have ever been proven to belong to the lost colonists. The same problem appears again and again in Roanoke research. There are clues, but they rarely become closure. And then there is the second serious candidate, movement inland toward the Albemarle Sound. This theory matters because it is not just speculation. On a map associated with John White, researchers later identified a concealed fort-like symbol roughly 50 miles inland near what is now Bertie County. The Park Service notes that White had told the colonists to move 50 miles inland if they left Roanoke. That instruction, combined with cartographic hints and later archaeology, created one of the most important non-Croatoan lines of inquiry in the case. This is where modern archaeology enters the story. The First Colony Foundation has spent years investigating inland sites, especially what became known as Site X. Their researchers argue that excavations there turned up English artifacts, including Surrey, Hampshire borderware and North Devon provisioning jars that are consistent with Elizabethan presence and may reflect activity by at least some Roanoke colonists. But they are also careful. Site X, in their own words, does not by itself represent proof of the relocation site for the majority of the colony. At most, it may point to a smaller group of survivors. Later work at Site Y added nuance rather than closure, suggesting the possibility of more than one relocation pattern. That changes the whole structure of the mystery, because if some colonists moved to Croatoan and others went inland, then the reason the colony is still lost may be simple. It was never one disappearance. It was several smaller disappearances unfolding at once. That idea also helps explain why the archaeology has been so frustrating. Researchers may not be failing to find the colony because they are looking in the wrong place. They may be failing because there was no single final place to find. And then there is the Chesapeake theory. At first glance, it sounds attractive because the Chesapeake Bay had been the intended destination of the 1,587 colony from the beginning. But the National Park Service notes two serious problems. First, White never actually sailed up there to search in 1590. Second, the journey would have required open water navigation, something not easily managed by a stranded group of settlers with no reliable maritime leadership. Almost 20 years later, Jamestown colonists heard indigenous reports suggesting that earlier English settlers in the Chesapeake had fought and died there. That is intriguing. But without hard archaeological support, the Chesapeake theory remains more rumor-backed than evidence-backed. So by this point in the story, the mystery has changed shape again. It is no longer, did they disappear? It is now, how many times did they move? How many groups did they become? And how much of the evidence was later erased by coastlines, storms, trade, war, and time? And that is a much harder mystery to solve. Part of the problem is the land itself. The Outer Banks are not stable in the way people from modern maps often imagine. Shorelines move, inlets open and close, storms reshape, coastlines, barrier islands erode. What looks today like a fixed historical stage was, in the late 16th century, already a changing environment. That matters because archaeology depends on survival, and survival depends on location. If portions of the evidence were built near unstable shorelines, then centuries of erosion, storms, sea level change, and human disturbance may have removed parts of the record long before modern researchers arrived. So when people ask, why hasn't archaeology solved Roanoke? The answer may not be that investigators missed something obvious. It may be that some of the most useful evidence no longer exists in recoverable form, and even where it does survive, the objects themselves may resist certainty. A 16th century English shard found inland can suggest contact, trade, or temporary occupation. It does not automatically prove a full colony relocation. That is why this mystery keeps producing promising clues and incomplete endings. Every discovery narrows the possibilities. Almost none of them closes the case. And for viewers, that can be frustrating. But historically, it is exactly what many real mysteries look like. Not silence, fragments. This is the point where Roanoke usually gets swallowed by folklore. Because when evidence is incomplete, myth rushes in. One of the oldest easy explanations is that a hurricane destroyed the colony. It sounds plausible, especially on the Outer Banks. The Park Service even notes that hurricanes absolutely hit the region, but White did not find the sort of destruction we would expect from a direct storm devastation theory. He specifically described the houses as taken down rather than smashed apart. That does not entirely eliminate weather as a factor in the colony's larger hardship, but it weakens the idea of one final catastrophic storm ending the settlement in place. Another familiar theory is famine and disease. Again, this is not absurd. The same NPS overview notes that a major drought struck the region beginning in 1587 and lasted for years, severely limiting food availability for both the English and surrounding Algonquian peoples. The colonists were under-provisioned from the start, and hardship almost certainly played some role in their suffering. But White did not report graves at the site, and the Park Service notes that the absence of obvious burial evidence weakens the idea that famine or disease simply wiped out the colony on Roanoke Island. More likely, hunger and illness were pressures that pushed movement, not necessarily the final answer by themselves. Then there is the Spanish attack theory. It survives because it fits the larger geopolitics of the period. England and Spain were at war. Spanish interests had every reason to monitor English intrusion into the Atlantic world. The Park Service notes that in 1588, a Spanish captain, Vicente Gonzalez, sailed to the Chesapeake and Outer Banks looking for English activity and found evidence of a boat slip near Roanoke. That sounds dramatic. But when White returned in 1590, he did not report signs of Spanish assault at the village site. No burned fort, no battlefield remains, no obvious military destruction. It remains possible that Spanish pressure shaped the wider fear of the colony, but as a final answer, it lacks direct support. And then there are the stories people want to believe because they feel like closure. The Dare stones are the best example. In the 20th century, a set of inscribed stones surfaced claiming to describe the fate of the colonists through a message allegedly written by Eleanor Dare. North Carolina's Department of Natural and Cultural Resources notes that the authenticity of the first stone remains debated, while all the later discovered stones are widely regarded as forgeries. In other words, even one of the most famous solutions to Roanoke lives in the same fog as the mystery itself, part evidence, part wish, part spectacle. That is the lesson of Roanoke myth-making. People do not just want an answer. They want the kind of answer that feels narratively satisfying. A massacre, a storm, a coded confession, a single burial hill, a final tragic message. But history often refuses to be that generous, and Roanoke may be one of the clearest examples of that refusal, because the strongest theories are not the cleanest ones. They are the messiest. Movement, fragmentation, absorption, loss of English identity, scattered groups leaving scattered traces. That kind of ending is much harder for legend to love, but it may be closer to the truth. It also explains why Roanoke has been repeatedly rewritten in fiction, folklore, television, and popular history. The real case is subtle. Popular versions often are not. They prefer secret cults, supernatural forests, total annihilation, cursed ground, or one final dramatic revelation hidden in plain sight. But the actual evidence keeps pulling the story back towards something less theatrical and more historically recognizable. A vulnerable colony, weak logistics, strained alliances, movement under pressure, and a record too thin to follow everyone after they left. That may sound less satisfying than the myth, but it gives the viewer something much more valuable, a clearer sense of how early colonial history actually worked, not as a sequence of neat victories and neat disasters, but as a chain of improvisations, misunderstandings, dependencies, and partial records. And once you see Roanoke that way, it stops being just a haunted anecdote from the edge of empire. It becomes one of the clearest examples of how history loses people long before it loses interest in them. So what do we really have after all these centuries? We have a colony of 117 people that arrived on Roanoke in 1587 when it had meant to go farther north. We have conflict, scarcity, a dangerous environment, and a governor forced back to England at exactly the wrong time. We have a 3-year delay caused by war. We have a return in 1590 to a settlement that looked not destroyed but intentionally vacated. We have Croatoan carved clearly, no distress cross, and multiple later lines of evidence that suggest relocation was not just possible but likely. We also have archaeology that points in more than one direction, including both Hatteras and inland Albemarle hypotheses, but no definitive site that lets the story snap shut. If I had to rank the possibilities, I would put them this way. First, the colonists almost certainly did not vanish in one magical moment. Second, the carved message strongly suggests that at least some of them moved deliberately, and White himself believed Croatoan was a safe destination. Third, the colony may have split, with some people moving south toward Croatoan and others inland toward the Albemarle Sound, which would explain why no single archaeological site has solved the case. And fourth, the reason Roanoke still feels so haunting may be that the most plausible answer is not spectacular death, but the slow erasure of a community through adaptation, movement, and absorption into worlds the English record did not continue to track. That is why this story matters. Not just because it is unsolved, but because it teaches a harder lesson about history itself. We often imagine disappearance as one dramatic event, but in the real past, disappearance is often gradual. A delay, a relocation, a renamed shore, a broken record, a coastline changed by weather, children growing up under different languages and loyalties, a colony no longer English, enough for English history to recognize it when it finally passes out of view. That is what Roanoke may really be. Not a colony that vanished into nothing, but a colony that slipped beyond the boundaries of the story its founders expected to tell. That is the deeper value of Roanoke, not just that it gives us a mystery to debate, but that it teaches us how to read historical absence more carefully. Sometimes the question is not, why was the answer hidden? Sometimes the question is, why do we expect the past to leave us one? Roanoke reminds us that many events do not end in a way that history can neatly archive. They dissolve into migration, into weather, into other communities, into children born under new loyalties, into coastlines that no longer match the map, into documents never written because the people who might have written them were already beyond the reach of the world that would later ask for them. And maybe that is why the Lost Colony still works so well as a historical mystery, because it never truly becomes a puzzle box with one key. It remains what many real past events are: a human story broken into pieces too early and recovered too late. Maybe the truth was never hidden in one dramatic ending. Maybe it was lost in movement, in distance, in time. That may be the most unsettling version of Roanoke. Not that no answer exists, but that the answer may be too scattered, too human, and too historically ordinary to ever return as a single clean revelation. Some mysteries survive because there is no evidence. Roanoke survives because the evidence points in several directions at once, and history, once it begins to scatter people across islands, sounds, alliances, and generations, is not always kind enough to gather them back together again. And what theories do you know? Write them in the comments. I read all of them. Press the subscribe button and comment, what case would you like to see next? One file closed, another one waiting. I'm Ilias, and I'll see you in the next case.